The call came in at 9 minutes past 9 on a Friday night. Garrett Boone was sitting at the far end of the Iron Wolves clubhouse in Cedar Ridge, Ohio, his coffee going cold beside a stack of paperwork he had been pretending to read for the better part of an hour when his phone buzzed once against the table. He picked it up without looking. He always picked up without looking when it was her number. 4 words, three-legged wolves limping. He went still for 4 seconds. The kind of still that had nothing to do with calm. Then he stood up and kicked over the chair he had been sitting in. The crash of it brought 14 heads around. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Someone set a beer bottle down on concrete with a sound that carried across the whole room. Garrett was already moving toward the door, pulling his cut off the back of his chair, in one motion the patch catching the overhead light for half a second before he had it on. A three-legged wolf stitched in silver thread on the back head, low, still moving. Marco Reyes was the one closest to the chair when it went over, and he was on his feet before it hit the ground. "Who do I need to call, Marco?" said, falling in step. "Nobody." Garrett did not slow down. "This one is mine. You want company." That was when he stopped. Not because he was thinking about the offer. He stopped because he needed Marco to hear the next 4 words without anything getting in the way. "Nobody rides with me." The room went quiet the way it went quiet when men who had ridden together for 15 years recognized a tone they had heard only a handful of times in all those years. Every one of those times, someone had ended up in a hospital or a courtroom or the ground. The 14 men in that room understood this without discussing it. They had learned to read Garrett Boone the way you learn to read weather in a part of the country where weather could kill you if you misread it. The parking lot outside the Iron Wolves clubhouse held the cold that belonged to early November in Ohio, the kind that got into a man's knuckles before he noticed his gloves were still hanging off the back of his bike. Garrett did not go back for them. His Harley sat where it always sat at the far end of the lot, a little apart from the others, not by accident. He swung a leg over it without ceremony, without the small rituals other men performed before a long ride. He was already somewhere else in his head. He was already on a highway that did not yet exist, doing math that had nothing to do with miles per hour, and everything to do with how many hours of darkness stood between him and a hospital room in Cedar Falls he had never seen. The engine came alive under him, loud and familiar, and for 1/2 of 1 second, the sound of it almost drowned out the 4 words sitting behind his teeth. Almost. He pulled out of the lot, and anyone watching from the clubhouse window might have called it controlled. They would have been wrong. The people who actually knew Garrett Boone understood that the stiller he looked on, the outside, the closer he was to something breaking loose on the inside. And right now, at 9:13 on a Friday night in November, he was as still as he had been in 11 years. Three-legged wolves limping. He had not heard those words in 11 years. Not since a phone call he still carried in pieces a situation at a dormitory in Columbus that had resolved before he even got his boots on. He had told himself afterward, the way a man told himself, the things that were more comfortable than the alternative, that she would never need to say those words again. That the code they had built as children in a dark house on Wicker Street had served its purpose and been retired. He had been wrong about that. The highway opened ahead of him, and he leaned into it and let the cold take whatever it wanted from his ungloved hands. 9 hours earlier, Claire Donovan had been standing in her kitchen in Cedar Falls making coffee. She would not finish when the argument started over something almost laughably ordinary. Weekend plans. A tone of voice that Reed Vance had decided she was using deliberately. The specific way he said her name when he had already decided the conversation was going in one direction and did not intend to allow it to go anywhere else. She had reached for her keys. She had said she was done with the conversation, which was something she had learned over 8 months to say as a complete sentence with nothing added to it, no softening, no qualifications, because every softening became a foothold for something she did not want back inside the room. She had made it as far as the door. Now she was sitting in a plastic chair in the emergency room of Millhaven General Hospital with her left arm immobilized in a temporary splint, and the particular quality of pain in her shoulder that told her the x-ray was not going to produce any surprises. Reed Vance was standing close enough that she could smell his cologne and feel the specific shift in his weight every time a nurse or an orderly moved past them. He had not touched her since they walked through the emergency room doors. He did not need to. 8 months of smaller lessons had taught her exactly what happened when she drew attention to herself in a public space in a way he had not planned for. She had learned the cost of that particular lesson in installments, each one smaller than the last, each one adding to a total she had been telling herself was not as large as it was. Her phone sat in her lap. She had reached for it twice. Both times his hand had closed around her right wrist before she got there, gentle enough that no one watching would have registered anything at all. And she had learned what pulling away cost, so she had not pulled away. The third time she waited. She waited until the nurse on the far side of the room turned to answer a question from a colleague. She waited until Reed's attention tracked toward the television mounted in the corner, running a muted sports broadcast he had no interest in. She waited until the particular tension in his shoulders shifted by 2 degrees in the direction of something that believed it had already won. Then she picked up the phone. She kept her voice flat. She kept her face toward the wall. She said the words into the phone the way you said something ordinary, the way you gave someone the time, or mentioned the weather, as if the man standing close enough to hear every syllable would have no frame of reference for what they meant. Three-legged wolves limping. I am at Millhaven General. She needs help. Reed's hand came down on her wrist again before she had finished the sentence. He was smiling at the wall across from them. He had no idea whose voice was on the other end of that line. He had no idea what was already turning onto the highway 300 miles north and pointing itself towards Cedar Falls at 90 miles an hour. Claire set the phone down and looked at the wall clock. 8 minutes past 9 in the evening. She had learned to count things. Minutes between a nurse's footsteps fading and the moment a hand finally lifted from her shoulder. Seconds between a raised voice and the settling of air that followed it. Counting gave her mind something precise to hold while the rest of her stayed level. She counted now and thought about the drive. She thought about the way he rode when something was broken, that needed addressing, the way the machine became less a vehicle and more a decision made continuously at whatever speed the road permitted. She had done this math once before that night in Columbus 11 years ago, and he had made 300 miles in under 3 hours. She had 90 minutes, maybe less. She was going to need every one of them. 8 months before any of this, Claire Donovan had been the kind of happy that made other people in a room feel like they were standing close to a warmth they had not expected and were not sure they were allowed to stay near. She had built her yoga studio herself, board by board, in a converted garage on Maple Street in Cedar Falls, 2 years after a marriage that ended quietly and without drama, the kind of ending that left her with a mortgage she could handle and a habit of sleeping with one lamp always on. She liked the particular silence of the studio at dawn, before anyone arrived, when the only sound was her own breath finding its rhythm against the floorboards she had sanded herself on a weekend in March. She had built the studio the way she built most things in her life, by showing up and doing the work and not expecting anyone to do it for her. She met Reed Vance at a barbecue thrown by Dax Briggs, who had ridden with her brother for close to 2 decades and whom Claire trusted the way you trusted a fact about the world that had never been wrong when you checked it. Reed had been polite in a way that Garrett clocked within the first 10 minutes as rehearsed. A firm handshake held a beat too long. A direct gaze calibrated to communicate confidence rather than actually feel it. He laughed at the right moments. He was handsome in a way that worked well in photographs and diminished slightly the moment you stopped looking at him directly, as though the quality of his appearance was partly a performance that required an audience. Garrett watched him for the better part of an hour that afternoon and said nothing, because what he was thinking was uncharitable and unprovable, and because Claire, who had not been consistently happy in longer than either of them wanted to acknowledge, was standing next to this man with something warm and genuine moving across her face. Something he had not seen on her face in long enough that the sight of it overruled the unease. So Garrett handed Reed a beer and stood down. The second time Garrett saw Reed Vance was 3 months later, when he dropped by Claire's apartment without calling, which was a habit she tolerated the way you tolerated a fixed truth about someone you loved that was not going to change regardless of how many times you acknowledged it could be inconvenient. Reed had been sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open. When he looked up and registered Garrett in the doorway, something moved across his face for less than a second. Not fear exactly. Recalibration. The expression of a man who had walked into a room expecting one set of conditions and was making rapid adjustments for another set entirely. Garrett filed it away without yet knowing what to do with it. He knew now. What no one outside that apartment had observed in the 8 months since that first barbecue was the slow and patient education Claire received in exactly how much of herself she was permitted to keep. It started small enough that she had been able to construct explanations for each individual piece. A comment about a dress that made her change before they left the house. A joke at a dinner party that landed like a slap and was waved off afterward as nothing, just teasing. She was always so sensitive about everything, wasn't she always so sensitive? A phone left face up on the counter that she eventually learned not to glance at twice. By the fourth month, she had stopped telling Hazel Ford certain things. Hazel had been her closest friend since the second week of freshman year at Ohio State, the kind of friend who believed that information was always preferable to the particular suffering caused by not having it. Claire had stopped telling her the small things because the small things had started accumulating into a shape she did not want to examine directly. And saying them out loud to Hazel would have required examining them. By the 6 months, she had become fluent in a language she had never asked to learn. She knew which topics were safe at which times of day. She knew the specific quality of silence that preceded something worse, and the different quality that preceded something that would be over quickly if she did not react. She knew how to make herself take up less space without appearing to do so deliberately. She had been a woman who built things with her hands. She had sanded her own floors. She had talked back to a contractor who tried to overcharge her and prevailed. She had filed her own taxes and pursued her ex-husband in small claims court and collected every dollar she was owed. She had done all of this and more. And somewhere inside 8 months, she had learned to make herself smaller and had called it compromise and had told herself that compromise was what adults did when they were trying to build something that lasted. Tonight had started over weekend plans. A raised voice, Claire reaching for her keys and saying clearly that she was done with the conversation. She had made it as far as the door. That was the part she had not told the nurse. Had not told anyone yet except the one person who needed to know it in 4 words that meant nothing at all to the man standing close enough to hear them spoken. In the examination room, the curtain pulled back just as Reed loosened his grip on Claire's wrist, and his face rearranged itself in under a second, jaw soft, eyes wide at the corners. A man assembled into the picture of concern so quickly that anyone watching would have thought the concern had always been there. "How is she doing?" he said, already moving to smooth the blanket across Claire's lap before the nurse could respond. "She won't tell me how bad the pain actually is. She never tells me these things." The nurse smiled at him with the warmth people extended toward men who said things like that. "We have her scheduled for a cast within the hour. You are a good one staying right here with her." "Wouldn't be anywhere else," Reed said, and he placed his hand on Claire's shoulder with his thumb, pressing in just enough that only she would know it was not tenderness. Claire kept her eyes on the wall clock. She counted the seconds between the sound of the nurse's footsteps receding down the corridor and the moment Reed's hand finally lifted from her shoulder. She had already said everything she needed to say. She had 90 minutes. She was going to use all of them, constructing the only thing she had left that was entirely hers to control. A plan solid enough that he could not find the seams in it. A plan built for a specific and practical purpose, not for the satisfaction of the thing, but because satisfaction without outcome was just noise. She had grown up as Garrett Boone's younger sister in a house that taught her certain things about survival that she had never had occasion to be grateful for until now. One of those things was this: the way you survived a conversation with Garrett was by arriving at it already completed. Not still thinking, not asking for permission. Finished in every detail so that what you were presenting was a structure rather than an idea. She did not want him going after Reed Vance with his hands. She understood exactly what that would cost. Not Reed, who in her plan would lose considerably more than one bad night could take from him. She meant Garrett himself, who had spent 11 years constructing something steadier than the version of himself that had once believed hurting someone and protecting someone were the same act. She had watched him build that steadier version. She was not going to be the reason it came undone. She wanted something that would end it completely. Not satisfy something in his blood for one violent hour and leave her managing the aftermath for the rest of both their lives. She thought about the wolf. Their grandfather's property in Wyandotte County had been the place where the pressure of the house on Wicker Street could be set down for a few weeks each summer and breathe through. The old man had found the animal at the edge of his back field, one March half-starved, one front leg gone entirely at the joint, the wound long healed into something smooth and permanent and strange. He had explained it to them the way he explained most things. No softening, no metaphor dressed up as something easier to receive. She had a mate once, he told them, kneeling in the dirt at a distance from the wolf that was careful without appearing to be. The mate was the one who took the leg. Fight over territory that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with what one animal had decided it was owed. She does not trust easily after that, but she trusts. That is the part worth noticing. Claire had named her Juniper. She and Garrett developed a way of approaching her without startling her, a low two-note whistle that Juniper learned to answer by lifting her head from wherever she had settled in the tall grass. There was a specific evening that Garrett still carried whole somewhere inside him. Claire, 9 years old and barefoot, on the porch steps, watching their grandfather kneel at a measured distance from the wolf and speak low and even into the space between them. "You do not rush something that has already been hurt by rushing," once the old man said. "You let it come to you on its own time, or you do not get to keep it at all." In those same years, with their father's temper moving through the house on Wicker Street on more nights than either of them wanted to count, the two children had built their own version of that lesson into a code. Three-legged wolves limping meant the storm had already started upstairs. Get to safety, make no sound. Their father had never understood it. He had never been listening for it. That was the entire architecture of the thing. Reed Vance had been standing close enough tonight to hear every word Claire spoke into that phone, and he had understood none of it for exactly the same reason. The most dangerous men in Claire Donovan's life had this in common. They mistook her silence for an empty room rather than for the place where she stored everything that actually mattered. 300 miles north, Garrett leaned into a curve in the highway and thought about that wolf. He thought about his grandfather's voice, low and even in the dirt, beside an animal that had already been hurt once by someone who had claimed to love her. He thought about the fact that he had not heard those 4 words in 11 years and had told himself during all those years that the silence meant Claire was safe rather than that he had stopped listening with sufficient attention. He was not going to make that particular error again. He did not know yet which version of himself was going to walk through those hospital doors. The version that solved problems at close range, which he had been very good at for a very long time, or the version he had spent 11 years working to construct, the one that understood there was another way to address a situation, even when every instinct was telling him the other way, was faster and more satisfying, and would produce an immediate and comprehensible result. He had 90 minutes to determine which version was going to walk through that door. He did not think about Reed Vance's face. If he thought about Reed Vance's face, he was going to have a clear answer to that question, and it was not going to be the one Claire needed from him tonight. He let the cold have his hands and pushed the machine harder and kept his mind on the road and on the math of distance and on a 9-year-old girl who had built a code for surviving the dark and trusted him to still know what it meant 20 years later. Back at Millhaven General, the younger nurse came in to check on the scheduling for the cast, and Reed told her the story of how he and Claire had met, the version he had been refining in his head since the parking lot, adjusting the details the way you adjusted any presentation for its intended audience. He was warm and self-deprecating and specific in the way that made people feel they were receiving something genuine. The nurse smiled. She told Claire she was lucky to have someone who cared so much. Claire looked at the ceiling tile above her, at a water stain shaped like nothing in particular, and found something in herself that still knew how to produce a smile in the appropriate places. "I know," she said. She thought about Owen months. She thought about the man who had driven 4 hours through a snowstorm because she had the flu and could not get off the couch, who had made soup from a recipe he found online and sat on the edge of her bed and watched television with her without making her feel like an imposition. She had tried in the hours when sleep would not come to hold that man up alongside the one whose thumb had just been pressing into her shoulder, and she had never once managed to make them align into a single coherent person. Her phone buzzed once against her hip, a single word on the screen visible only to her. "Coming." She did not respond. She did not need to. Somewhere on a dark Ohio highway, a man who had not once in 29 years of her life failed to show up when she needed him to was closing the distance. And for the first time since Reed's hand had found her wrist in the kitchen doorway of her apartment, Claire allowed herself to breathe all the way to the bottom of her lungs. 90 minutes, she thought, maybe less the way he rides. She had 90 minutes to decide what she was going to say to her brother, and to decide with equal precision what she was absolutely not going to allow him to do. The automatic doors at the far end of the corridor opened at 11 minutes past 11, and Claire felt the change in the room before she turned to look. This was something she had been observing her whole life without being fully able to account for it, the way a space reorganized itself around Garrett Boone without him requiring it to. The security guard near the entrance, who had been leaning against the wall, shifted upright without appearing to notice he was doing it. Two nurses at the station went quiet in the middle of a sentence. Even the overhead television broadcasting a muted late-night program seemed somehow less present. Garrett crossed the waiting area in 9 steps. He did not look at the nurses' station. He did not look at the rows of plastic seating or the people occupying them. He looked at her cast, and something moved through his jaw, a tightening, then a deliberate release, then a flatness that was in some ways harder to look at than either of those had been. Then his eyes came up to her face. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. It was such an ordinary exchange for what the night had been that she nearly laughed. Nearly. He crossed the remaining distance and stopped close enough that she could smell the November highway still clinging to his jacket, that specific combination of cold air and distance and engine oil, and he did something he almost never did in front of other people. He reached out and placed one hand carefully against the side of her face. 3 seconds. Then he dropped it and stepped back, and the moment closed over itself the way water closed over a disturbance. "Where is he?" Garrett said. Not a question. A coordinate he was already plotting against a map he had been building in his head for the last 3 hours. "Garrett, where is he right now?" She kept her voice at the level she had practiced for 90 minutes in a plastic hospital chair. "He went to get coffee. He will be back in a few minutes. And before you say anything else, I need you to actually hear what I want from you tonight. Not what your hands want to do, what I need from you." Something moved behind his eyes quickly enough that a stranger would have missed it entirely. It was not the anger she had been prepared to manage. It was older than anger and closer to the center of something. Grief, she thought. Not for her arm, though there was that too. For every version of this conversation they had not been able to have as children, in a house where the asking had never once been sufficient to stop what was already in motion. "I am listening," he said. The fact that he said it at all, instead of simply moving past her toward wherever Reed Vance was standing in a cafeteria line with 2 coffees he had no idea he was never going to finish, told Claire more about the 11 years since they had left that house on Wicker Street than anything he could have said in plain language. She told him the plan, all of it from the beginning, without omissions, because she had been raised alongside this man, and she knew exactly how precisely he could detect the shape of something that had been left out. She told him about the discharge papers, about the imaging report and what it documented in language that was clinical and irrefutable, about Reed's position with Arrowwood Holdings and what she intended to ask for and what she intended to use as the weight behind the asking. She told it about the written statement, Reed's own handwriting, bearing witness against himself, which was the piece she had arrived at somewhere around the 40th minute in that chair, and which she had turned over and examined from multiple angles until it felt solid enough to carry weight. Garrett listened with his jaw set and his hands completely still at his sides. When she finished, he was quiet long enough that she counted 4 seconds. "That is not enough," he said. "It is not about enough. It is about it actually working. You address this with your hands, and in 6 months, Reed is the story people are telling. A year from now, he is the victim in it, and I am the unstable woman who turned her biker brother against him for no reason. I need something that follows him, something that does not allow him to write the version he would prefer." Garrett looked at her for a long moment, the specific kind of look she remembered from 2 occasions before in their shared lives, both of which had preceded something the other party had not found pleasant. "You already know how to do this," he said. It was not entirely a question. "I have had 90 minutes in a hospital chair to construct it, yes. Tell me what you need." "Presence. Not a confrontation. Presence. I need him to understand precisely what he put his hands on tonight without you laying a finger on him. Can you do that?" The silence that followed lasted more than 4 seconds. Down the hallway, a vending machine cycled through a sound. A gurney wheel turned somewhere out of sight. The clock above the nurse's station advanced through 1 complete minute while neither of them moved. Garrett Boone, president of an Iron Wolves chapter that held more of the state than most people in Cedar Falls had ever thought to learn, stood very still and worked through the hardest calculation of his night. Not the distance to Reed Vance's building. The distance he himself had traveled since he was 18 years old, and absolutely certain that hurting someone and protecting someone were interchangeable acts. He thought about what it had taken to learn that they were not. He thought about what it would cost to hold on to that knowledge right now, with the discharge papers from his sister's emergency room visit in his jacket pocket. "Yes," he said, "I can do that. Reed came around the corner from the cafeteria corridor carrying 2 coffees and wearing the expression of a man who had decided he had already navigated the worst of the situation. He stopped when he registered who was standing beside Claire's chair. The coffee stilled in his hands. For 1 second, something unprocessed moved across his face. Not fear yet. The first proximity of it. Recognition that the room had rearranged itself during his absence in a way he had not accounted for. He recovered in under 8 seconds. Garrett clocked the recovery time and stored it because the recovery time told you something about a man that the initial reaction often concealed. Reed extended one of the coffees toward Garrett in the manner of someone establishing themselves as the calmest person in a room before anyone else can make that determination. "You must be Garrett. Claire has mentioned you." Garrett looked at the coffee. He looked at the hand holding it. He did not take either one. "I know who I am," he said, and his voice carried none of the heat Reed had braced himself to receive, which made it land with considerably more weight than Ray's volume would have managed. "The question is whether you understand who you are talking to." Reed's expression adjusted by a degree. "Look," he said, shifting his weight, his free hand opening in the universal gesture of a reasonable man confronting an unreasonable situation. "I do not know what Claire told you, but this is more complicated than it looks. We were arguing. She pulled away from me and lost her balance. I did not mean to." "Stop talking, Bo," Garrett said. 4 words flat and without inflection, and something in their delivery made the security guard near the entrance straighten and look over without understanding why he was doing it. Reed stopped talking. Garrett turned to Claire, and his voice changed entirely, dropping to something low and certain, and meant only for her. "I am driving you home. Both of you can come in my truck, or you can find your own way. I do not have a preference." Reed's eyes moved between the two of them. That recalibration again, more extended this time, because the variables in the room had changed in a way he was only beginning to calculate. "I will drive myself," Reed said. "Good," Garrett said. "That gives you time to think about Monday." "What happens Monday?" Garrett did not answer. He picked up Claire's discharge papers from the seat beside her, folded them once with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had already decided what they were going to be used for, and placed them in the inside pocket of his jacket. "Monday," he said again to the air of the corridor, rather than to Reed specifically. And he walked Claire toward the exit without once looking back to see whether Reed Holloway followed, because the answer to that question had ceased to matter the moment he put those papers in his pocket. Outside, the parking lot was lit by overhead lamps throwing long yellow shapes across the asphalt. Garrett held the passenger door for Claire with one hand, his other resting just above her elbow, without touching the cast, careful in a way that contradicted everything Cedar Falls believed it understood about him. Claire settled into the passenger seat and heard the door close and let herself, for the first time since 9 minutes past 9, simply exist somewhere that was not that room. She did not ask where they were going. She already knew. His place in Cedar Ridge was 3 hours north. Her apartment was 6 blocks from the hospital. Both of them understood without saying it that she was not going back to the apartment she had shared with Reed Vance. She thought about Juniper, about a 3-legged wolf in the tall grass of her grandfather's property in Wyandotte County, having survived the thing that tried to finish her, and learned over time to lift her head when a particular sound came through the grass. Her arm hurt with a clean and specific pain she found easier to hold than the other kind. The plan was built. It was solid. Monday was 3 days away. Garrett pulled out of the lot and pointed north and said nothing, which was exactly right, and in the quiet between them, Claire noticed that the specific pressure that had been residing behind her sternum for 8 months had shifted by some small but measurable degree. Not gone. She did not expect gone, but different. Lighter in the way that a space felt different when a window that had been painted shut for too long was finally opened. She watched Cedar Falls recede through the passenger window, the hardware store on Clement Street, the coffee shop on Daly and Fourth, the intersection where she never ran the long light even when no one was watching. Her town, her life, the one she had constructed herself from materials she gathered alone. She was not giving any part of it back. Garrett did not sleep that night. Claire did eventually, somewhere past 2 in the morning, her head tipped against the passenger window, her breathing going slow and even in the pattern that told him the adrenaline had exhausted itself and left her body with nothing remaining to run on. He drove the last stretch of highway in complete silence, with one hand on the wheel and the heater running low, and the road empty enough that he could allow his mind to go where it needed to without losing track of the asphalt. He thought about Reed Vance in that waiting room, assembling himself back into reasonableness in under 8 seconds. He thought about what a recovery time that fast indicated about how practiced the performance was. He thought about a great number of things in that last hour, and most of them were not thoughts he was going to act on, but they were present the way certain thoughts were always present in men who had spent the majority of their lives solving problems through direct intervention. And he let them move through him without handing any of them authority over his next action. This was harder than it sounded. He had only recently developed any real skill at it. He got Claire settled into the spare room just before 3 in the morning. She woke enough to tell him she was fine, that she could manage in her own apartment, that she did not require monitoring like she was 12 years old. He told her she could debate it in the morning. She was asleep again before he had finished the sentence. He went to the kitchen table and sat down and put his hands flat on either side of a cup of coffee he did not want, and remained there. He was still there when his phone showed 6:15 and Dax Briggs called. Dax had been with the Iron Wolves for 19 years. Before that, 11 years as a financial crimes investigator for the Ohio Attorney General's office, which was a fact that surprised people who did not know him and surprised absolutely no one who did. He retained information with the patience of a man who understood that timing was most of the value in knowing something. He had been making calls since shortly after midnight. "I found something," Dax said without preliminary. Garrett said nothing and waited. "Sandra Wells, Columbus. 3 years ago, she filed a civil complaint against a Reed Vance employed as a regional director for a property company called Arrowwood Holdings. The complaint alleged a pattern of coercive behavior, documented physical intimidation, one incident involving a vehicle. Filed in March, withdrawn 6 weeks later." "She changed her mind," Garrett said. "That is what the paperwork reflects," Dax said. "But she relocated from Columbus 11 days after the withdrawal, left a position at a school where she had worked for 4 years. No forwarding address on record. A mutual acquaintance of hers told someone the following year that Sandra had not in fact changed her mind, that a conversation had taken place with Sandra's boyfriend at the time. The conversation communicated that his continued involvement in the complaint would create certain complications for him, for both of them." Garrett's hand tightened around the coffee cup. "The boyfriend ended his involvement with Sandra shortly after that conversation," Dax continued. "Sandra withdrew the complaint. Sandra left Columbus. The complaint closed. Reed Vance retained his position and was promoted to regional director the following September." "How long have you known this?" Garrett said. "Since approximately 2 this morning. I have been attempting to locate a contact for Sandra Wells since 3. She is currently in Western Pennsylvania under a married name. Still working on a number." "Do not contact her yet," Garrett said. "Understood. I need everything you can locate on the original complaint, the filing documents, any records that survive the withdrawal, anything with his name that exists from those 6 weeks." "Already working on it," Dax said. The call ended. Garrett sat with what Dax had described. "The way you sat was something you could not unknow and had not yet found the correct use for." He had expected in some imprecise way to learn that Reed Vance was a man who had done a harmful thing once in circumstances that might have been complicated or unclear. What Dax was describing was a method, a sequence of steps that had been applied before and refined through application. A man who understood how to locate the pressure points surrounding a problem and apply sufficient force to eliminate the problem while appearing to do nothing at all. He had done this before. He had been rewarded for it 9 months after doing it. He had gotten more precise. Garrett thought about Claire in the next room with a cast on her left arm and 90 minutes of planning sitting inside her like a completed structure. He thought about the fact that Reed Vance had been alone with her in that waiting room for 2 hours before Garrett arrived, which meant he had been doing his own planning during that time, adjusting, preparing the version of events he intended to deploy when the confrontation arrived. He thought about Sandra Wells packing whatever she could carry out of a life she had spent 4 years assembling in Columbus and leaving without a forwarding address. He picked up the coffee mug, set it down. He thought about Theo, the counselor he had been seeing every other Thursday since a conversation with Dax the previous spring that had gone further than either of them expected. Theo had an office above a hardware store in a town 20 minutes east of Cedar Ridge, and a manner of receiving information that communicated neither surprise nor judgment, only sustained attention. He had said something 4 weeks ago in the context of a different situation that Garrett found himself returning to now. "The version of you that wants to fix this with your hands is not wrong to want that," Theo had said. "He has simply been the only version you have made available for a very long time. That does not mean he has to remain the only one. Garrett had not completely believed it when Theo said it. He was not certain he completely believed it now. But he had told Claire yes in a hospital hallway, and he intended to keep that yes intact through whatever Saturday and Sunday and Monday required of him. The difficulty was that the man who had done this before and been promoted for it was not a man who would be adequately addressed by the application of straightforward force. Force would produce a night, possibly two. Then Claire would be managing the aftermath of a club president's assault charge, while Reed reconstructed himself as the wrong party in whatever city he moved to next. Garrett needed something that would follow Reed Vance, something that moved with him wherever he went. He picked up his phone at 6:50 and called Dax back. "I need you to do something before Monday morning," he said. He used 9 words that carried the weight of the instruction and several that were logistics. When the call ended, Dax sat up in bed in his house, 8 miles from the clubhouse, turned on the lamp on his nightstand, and picked up a legal pad from the nightstand drawer. He made a list. Saturday arrived in Cedar Falls gray and without distinguishing characteristics. Reed Vance had his laptop open at 6:45. He was not a man who slept badly, which made the fact that he had spent most of Friday night awake instructive, in a way he did not dwell on. He set the information aside and focused on what he could govern. He spent 22 minutes composing an email to Wendy Holt, the regional HR director for Arrowwood Holdings, Ohio and Pennsylvania operations. The version he sent was the 7th he had drafted. It described a difficult personal situation involving a former partner who had been experiencing emotional difficulties for some time. It mentioned a recent incident in which she had become agitated during a disagreement, lost her balance, and sustained an injury in falling. It communicated his concern for her well-being, while establishing precisely that he had not been present when the injury occurred, that he had gone to the hospital immediately upon learning of it, that he had attempted to support her through what was clearly a distressing period. It noted with careful regret that she appeared to have involved her brother, a man with certain professional associations, that were making the situation feel unpredictable. It was in every measurable respect a careful and accomplished piece of work. It established his version of events with the people who mattered most before anyone else could reach them. It positioned him as a reasonable party in an unreasonable situation. It asked for nothing. It simply placed his account on record first. He sent it at 7:43 and felt the particular settling that came from having moved before the other side had moved. He did not know that Dax Briggs had placed a phone call at 6:51 that morning. He did not know that the call had gone to the main intake line for Arrowwood Holdings' parent company, 2 organizational levels above Wendy Holt, and that the man who received it had taken careful and specific notes about a Sandra Wells in Columbus and a civil complaint that had been filed and then withdrawn, following a conversation with a third party connected to Reed Vance, along with the case number in the county of filing and the name of the attorney Sandra had initially retained. Reed sent his email and closed the laptop and made breakfast and spent the remainder of Saturday morning preparing himself for a conversation he believed he still controlled. He was wrong about that. He simply did not yet know he was wrong. Hazel Ford drove 40 minutes from Dayton on Saturday evening without calling ahead, which was consistent with the way she operated inside the friendships she had decided were permanent. She arrived at the door of the apartment where Claire was staying with Garrett's hospitality and knocked 3 times in the pattern Claire had known since freshman year, and she was holding a bottle of red wine she described as appropriate, regardless of the hour, and she was not leaving until it was gone. Claire let her in. They sat at the kitchen table. Claire's left arm rested on a folded dish towel. Hazel put her phone face down on the counter when she came in and did not look at it again. She poured 2 glasses and set one in front of Claire and held the other and waited with the patience of someone who had decided that silence tonight was more valuable than questions. "You do not have to talk about it," Hazel said. "I know," Claire said. She turned her water glass in slow revolutions on the table. "I think I want to. I just cannot figure out where it starts." "Start with the part you have not told anyone yet." Claire looked at her across the table. Something in Hazel's face, its steadiness, its complete absence of the alertness that would have meant she was already composing her response, released something that had been held at tension in Claire's chest since Friday afternoon. So she told her. Not the version she had given the nurse clinical and contained and designed to communicate the essential facts without implication. Not the version she had presented to Garrett in the truck, a completed plan in search of a yes. The actual version. The one that started 8 months ago at a barbecue on a Saturday afternoon in September, When a man with a calibrated handshake had said something that made her laugh in a way she had not laughed in long enough that the feeling of it caught her off guard. She told her about the dress. She told her about the dinner party and the quality of the silence in the car on the way home. She told her about the phone and the education and not looking at it twice, and the explanations she had constructed for herself about why that was a reasonable accommodation for a person in a serious relationship to make. She told her about month 4 and month 5 and month 6 and the specific accumulation of small adjustments that had assembled themselves into a shape she had been declining to look at directly. She told her about reaching for her keys on Friday night and making it as far as the door. Hazel listened all the way through without reaching for her phone once, without once saying the words "I told you so," which Claire observed with private and considerable gratitude, because there had been at least 2 points in the preceding 8 months when Hazel would have been entirely justified in saying them. When Claire finished, Hazel reached across the table and held her good hand. "I need to say something," Hazel said. "Okay. I saw it, not Friday, but I saw something around month 3 or 4, the specific way he talked over you when we all had dinner together. Not carelessly, deliberately, in a way that was designed to make you smaller in a room full of people without leaving you anything solid to point at afterward. I saw it, and I chose not to say anything because you were genuinely happy, and I did not want to be the person who interfered with that." The space between them held a moment. "You are saying you are sorry. I am saying I should have told you sooner." Claire looked at her hand inside Hazel's. "You would have told me, and I would have heard you, and I would have explained it away and defended him, and probably been angry with you for a week. I know myself." "Maybe," Hazel said, "but I should have said it regardless." They sat with that for a while, carrying versions of the same regret from different positions. "I am proud of you," Hazel said eventually. "Not for what happened, for what you are about to do." "I have not done anything yet. You have already decided. I can see it on you. You made the decision somewhere between that hospital and this table." Claire thought about that lying awake later with her cast on a pillow and the apartment quiet in a way it had not been quiet in 8 months. The specific quality of silence that came from being in a space where she was not constantly measuring the temperature of someone else's mood. She had decided. Hazel was right. The decision had assembled itself without her fully registering it, happening the way the most consequential decisions sometimes did not in a single dramatic moment, but through the accumulation of 100 small refusals to accept a smaller version of herself as the final one. She thought about Monday. She thought about the structure of what she had built in that plastic chair. She thought about Garrett, 300 miles north, sitting at a kitchen table. She could not see with his hands flat on a surface and his mind on the same problem from a different angle. Reed Vance spent Sunday constructing a secondary approach. The email to Wendy Holt had been the correct first move. He still believed this. A first move was only valuable as part of a sequence. The difficulty with Garrett Boone was that he was a variable Reed had no reliable model for. Men who operated outside institutional structures the way Garrett did were not susceptible to the kinds of pressure Reed was skilled at applying. They did not respond to reputational risk or professional consequence or the careful assembly of a sympathetic narrative. They responded to older things, which meant he needed to work around the perimeter of the problem. He found Hazel Ford's number in a contact list he had maintained access to through a shared account during the months he and Claire had been together. He had met Hazel twice. He had paid attention both times. She was, from what he had observed, a woman who valued reasonableness and had strong feelings about not letting emotion override judgment. He composed the text with the same care he had applied to the email. He said he understood things were complicated, and that was the last outcome he had wanted. He said he was concerned about Claire making decisions in a moment of acute distress that she might find she regretted once the situation had stabilized. He said he respected their friendship and believed they both wanted the same thing, which was for this to resolve itself without anyone sustaining more damage than had already occurred. He sent the text at 11:47 on Sunday morning. Hazel Ford looked at it for 4 seconds. Then she captured a screenshot and sent it directly to Claire without comment or annotation. Claire looked at the screenshot on her phone for a long moment. She set the phone on the table. She picked it up and looked at it again. Then she set it down and sat with what it confirmed. He was not frightened. He was executing a sequence. He had moved from Wendy Holt to Hazel Ford with the systematic efficiency of someone who had run this process before and understood which pressure points to probe in which order. She called Garrett. She told him about the text. She heard him go quiet in the way that meant he was filing rather than reacting. He just confirmed something Garrett said. What? That he is not in a panic. He is working a progression. Men in a panic call the person directly. Men who are running a sequence go sideways and look for softer access points. Claire was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. I know you know. I am saying it out loud so we are both clear about who we are walking into Monday with. After she ended the call, she sat at the kitchen table for a long time and went through the structure of her plan, the way a builder checked a framework before trusting load to it. She found nothing she wanted to alter. The plan was sound. She had built it from the right materials. She thought about her grandfather's voice, low and measured in the dirt. You do not rush something that has already been hurt by rushing once. That evening, Garrett sat alone in the Cedar Ridge kitchen with a manila folder Dax had dropped at his door without coming inside, which was a form of consideration Garrett registered and appreciated. The folder contained printed records from the original civil complaint Sandra Wells had filed 3 years prior, recovered through a contact of Dax's in the Franklin County court system. It contained Dax's notes from his conversation with the person who had spoken to Patricia Olin. It contained a real estate transaction record showing that Reed Vance had closed a significant commission in the same week Sandra Wells withdrew her complaint. Garrett read through it twice. Then he put both hands flat on either side of the folder and did not read it a third time. He sat with the picture it painted. A man who had identified a problem, applied calibrated pressure to the people surrounding the problem, and dissolved the problem entirely while appearing to take no direct action whatsoever. A man who had then been promoted 9 months later. Every instinct he had accumulated over 44 years was providing him with a clear and direct prescription for this situation. He sat with those instincts the way Theo had suggested, sitting with them, not fighting them, not pretending they were absent, simply not handing them the authority to make the next decision. He thought about being 18. He thought about the version of himself that had inhabited that age and believed that hurting someone and protecting someone were functionally identical acts. He thought about Claire sitting in a plastic hospital chair, constructing something he could not have built and asking him specifically to trust it. He picked up his phone and called Dax. I need you to complete something before Monday morning, he said. The call ran 40 seconds. He spoke 9 words that carried the weight of the instruction and a handful more that were logistics. When the call ended, Dax turned on the light on his nightstand and took a legal pad from the drawer and wrote a list. He worked until past 2 in the morning. He was thorough in the way that came from years of building cases out of documentation, the skill of assembling individual records into a sequence that communicated a pattern without requiring anyone to characterize it editorially. He called the HR intake director at Arrowwood Holdings parent company at 6:51 on Monday morning. He was factual and professional and did not mention Garrett's name or the Iron Wolves or deploy language that could be characterized as threatening. He described a documented situation, provided a case number, referenced available court records, and noted the existence of a text message sent to a third party the previous day that could reasonably be interpreted as an attempt to discourage a witness. He thanked the man and ended the call. He sent Garrett 2 words: done, clean. Garrett read the text at 7:04 in the morning. He set the phone face down on the table and breathed. He thought about Claire. He thought about her sitting across from Hazel Ford with a cast on her arm and a completed plan in her head that she had assembled herself from 90 minutes and 29 years of knowing exactly what survival required. He thought about a 9-year-old girl barefoot on porch steps watching a wolf that had learned after everything to lift her head when the right sound came through the grass. He thought about what she had asked of him specifically. Presence, not confrontation, presence. He was going to drive to Cedar Falls at a reasonable speed and park 3 car lengths from wherever Dax dropped her off, and he was going to wait. He was going to be the weight behind the room, the fact expressed as sound below a window, the presence she had asked him to be. He was going to let her finish what she had started in a plastic hospital chair on a Friday night. This was the hardest calculation he had made in a long time, and he had made the other kind of calculations on a dark highway in the cold with no gloves, so that told him something about how much this particular effort was costing him. He was going to pay it. Claire was awake at 8. She had slept 4 hours, which was more than she had expected and less than she needed and exactly what she had. She made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the November light come up flat and gray over Cedar Falls, uncommitted to any particular outcome. She took a shower. She got dressed. She chose each item, deliberately applying the same consideration she had given every element of the plan, because she understood something about the psychology of the kind of confrontation she was walking into that Reed Vance had apparently never had occasion to learn. The person who arrives looking as though they expected to be there already owns the room before a word is exchanged. She called Dax at 8:45. He picked up on the second ring and told her without her asking that he had made a call that morning and that certain information was now in the appropriate hands and that she should have that information before she walked into the building. Claire listened. She was quiet after he finished. He is going to know, she said. When he looks at me, he is going to understand that something has happened that he did not plan for. Probably, Dax said. Good, she said. She picked up the manila folder from the kitchen table. Inside it were the discharge papers from Millhaven General, the imaging report, the radiologist's notes, the timestamp at 4:47 in the afternoon on Friday, the diagnosis expressed in language that belonged to facts rather than to any particular account of how the facts had come to be. She put on her coat. She touched the plan once more, not reviewing it, simply confirming it was still there and still solid. It was. She opened the door and stepped into the cold November morning, and Dax was at the curb with the engine running, and 3 blocks behind them, in a direction she did not look a man. On a Harley sat with his hands on the grips and waited for her to go first. The drive to Reed Vance's building took 11 minutes. Claire counted them, not to accelerate the passage of time, but to give her mind something precise to hold, while the rest of her managed the work of staying level. Dax drove without conversation, which was exactly right. He carried the kind of silence that competent people brought into difficult situations, the kind that communicated I am here without requiring anything in return. She watched Cedar Falls move past the window, the hardware store on Clement Street, the coffee shop on Daly and Fourth where she had met Reed for what became their first real date, the long intersection where she had never run the light even when no one was watching. Her town, her life, the one she had constructed herself from materials she had gathered and carried and set into place with her own hands. She was not surrendering any part of it. Reed's building was a 6-story brick structure on the north end of downtown, built in the 70s and partially renovated twice since without fully committing to either renovation. Dax pulled to the curb in front of it. Claire sat for a moment with the folder on her lap and her good hand resting flat on top of it. The person who arrives expecting to be there already owns the room. She had built space in the plan for the possibility that she would arrive here and find herself smaller than the work required. She had written contingency sentences for that version of herself. She did not need them. She was exactly the size the plan required, perhaps marginally larger. She got out. She crossed the small parking area to the front entrance and pressed the call button for Reed's unit. He buzzed hers in on the first attempt. She had not anticipated this. She had prepared for an intercom exchange, had rehearsed the words for it. His voice came through the speaker almost immediately, careful and conciliatory, in a register she had not once heard from him in 8 months of proximity. "Come up," he said, as though she were arriving for something scheduled and ordinary. The elevator opened on the 4th floor. The hallway smelled of someone else's cooking from a higher-level garlic and something herbed entirely ordinary and faintly absurd against the specific weight of what she was carrying toward that door at the end of the corridor. She knocked once. He opened it before her second knock landed. The apartment was unchanged, which struck her as briefly strange that the furniture and the light through the windows and the arrangement of objects on his kitchen counter should remain exactly as they had been when everything else had reorganized itself so completely. He had not redecorated for the occasion of his own reckoning. Reed was sitting on the couch. He had placed himself in a posture she had not previously seen on him. Shoulders drawn inward, elbows on his knees, hands held together between them. The deliberate construction of smallness. She recognized the technique because she had spent 6 months becoming practiced at it herself, and seeing it on him produced a feeling she noted and set aside. She had expected anger. She had built extensive preparation for anger, for the version of Reed that used volume and absolute certainty as instruments, and for the more refined version that deployed the language of misunderstanding and overreaction. She had also, at the outer edge of her preparation, allowed for the possibility of this, a man who had received information he had not planned for and was sitting with the knowledge that the room had already changed before she arrived. She filed it and moved forward. She stayed standing. She had planned this geometry specifically because the person standing in a room is the person the room belongs to, and she intended to hold that position for exactly as long as it took to complete what she had come to do. I am going to say what I came to say, she told him. Then you are going to listen to what I am offering, and you are going to accept it because it is the only version of today that does not end with my brother's name attached to whatever follows you out of this city. Something moved across his face at the mention of Garrett. Not yet fear, the nearest relative of it. Are we clear? He was very still. Yes, he said. She opened the folder. She placed the discharge papers on the coffee table between them, oriented, so he could read every line without effort. Then the imaging report, the radiologist's notes, the date, the time stamped at 4:47 in the afternoon on Friday, the diagnosis rendered in the language that belonged to clinical facts and not to anyone's preferred interpretation of them. She placed them as you placed evidence, as a foundation, a thing that existed independent of anyone's relationship to it. I want you to understand what this conversation is built on, she said. There is nothing you are going to tell me in the next 10 minutes that changes what those documents say. So do not expend either of our time attempting to do that. Reed's eyes moved over the papers. She watched him read. She observed the moment he arrived at the radiologist's notes, and something shifted in his expression along a line she had not previously seen there. Not remorse exactly. The first genuine fear she had ever watched move across his face, the kind that had nothing to do with Garrett and everything to do with the specific and non-negotiable quality of clinical documentation applied to something he had done. He opened his mouth, the beginning of a sentence that sounded as though it started with, "I grabbed your arm, I did not mean," and she watched him close it again before it could complete, as if some new and unfamiliar instinct had finally communicated to him that the currency he had always spent in moments like this was no longer being accepted in this room. You do not get to tell me what happened, Claire said. I was there, I know what happened. What I need from you now is a decision. She presented the offer. She delivered it as she had rehearsed it sentence following sentence, leaving no space between them where negotiation could find a foothold. He would submit his resignation to the regional office at Arrowwood Holdings by the end of the current week, identifying personal reasons as the cause. He would do this before the formal HR complaint she had already prepared made the decision unavoidable for him in a way that traveled with his name to every subsequent application for the following decade. He would vacate his Cedar Falls apartment within 30 days. He would maintain no contact with her in any form, direct or through any intermediary, which was a word she used with intention and watched register on him with the weight she had intended it to carry. He would not place calls. He would not send messages. He would not ask mutual acquaintances to carry communications on his behalf. She watched his expression during the portion about intermediaries and watched him understand that she knew about the text to Hazel Ford. And he would understand she continued without anyone needing to articulate it as a formal element of the agreement that the alternative to all of this involved a club whose reach extended considerably further into this state than he had ever troubled himself to learn. A club whose president had driven 300 miles on a Friday night and was currently positioned within 3 blocks of this building. She let that rest. If I do not, he began. Then you'll learn what Monday means, she said. She did not raise her voice. She did not require volume for this. Outside the window of his apartment, from somewhere below on the street, a motorcycle engine maintained a steady idle at exactly the volume necessary to be heard through glass without being threatening. Not a declaration, a fact expressed in sound, a presence made audible. Reed's eyes moved to the window. They returned to her face, and she watched it occur. The thing she had spent 90 minutes in a hospital chair, working toward the thing she had rebuilt in a kitchen and rehearsed at a table and carried through an elevator and a corridor and a door she had no intention of crossing again after today. She watched the last of his resistance leave his body, not with drama, not with any of the theatrical qualities she might have anticipated from a man who had performed reasonableness so skillfully for so long. Just a deflation, a settling. Okay, he said. Quiet, final. Okay. She held his eyes long enough to be certain of what she had heard. Then she moved to the final item. There is one more thing, she said. He looked up at her. You are going to write down in your own words exactly what happened on Friday evening. Not for my benefit, for the file. In case you determine at some point in the future that the version of this story you would prefer to be telling is one in which this injury occurred differently. She set a pen and a single sheet of paper on the coffee table beside the documents. She watched his jaw work. She had planned for anger at this juncture, and the anger did not materialize. What appeared instead was something she had not seen on him before or form, and found unexpectedly clarifying the expression of a man who had encountered the one demand he had not prepared for. Not his money, not his position, his own handwriting bearing permanent witness against himself, existing in a file that would be consulted for contingencies he could not govern. He looked at the pen, he looked at the paper. He picked up the pen. He wrote 4 sentences. His handwriting was precise and controlled, the same script she had once considered an indicator of reliability. She did not observe him while he wrote. She looked at the water stain on the ceiling above the kitchen doorway and kept her breathing measured and her hands still at her sides. When he set the pen down, she took the sheet without reading it. She folded it once and placed it inside the manila folder with the discharge papers and the imaging report and everything else. She did not acknowledge it further. It was part of the structure now, and structures did not require commentary. She gathered the folder. She stood with it under her good arm. For a sustained moment, the two of them existed in the same room across a coffee table that held between them the entire accumulated weight of 8 months. Everything that had been built and everything that had come apart in the building and everything that had been done in the coming apart. She had not scripted what came next. This was the only element of Monday she had left unwritten because there were things that could not be rehearsed without becoming something other than what they needed to be. And this needed to be true. "I loved you," she said. Her voice held its level, not cold, not performative, level which was its own form of precision. "I want you to understand that before I walk out of this door. I loved the version of you that drove 4 hours through a snowstorm to bring me soup when I was sick. I do not know where he went. I have spent a significant portion of the last several months trying to determine whether he ever existed in the way I believed he did, or whether I assembled him out of what I was shown and what I needed to be real. I do not have an answer to that, but I loved him. What I felt was genuine, and it belongs to me. That part is mine to carry. Not yours." She was not waiting for him to respond. She was simply completing the sentence that this particular Monday had always been going to end with the sentence that had existed in the plan before she had known its exact words. She turned. She walked to the door. She opened it. She did not look back. The hallway smelled of garlic and old carpet and the specific neutral quality of a building corridor where strangers lived their private lives 3 feet from one another. She pulled the door shut behind her and stood in the quiet for a moment. Then she walked to the elevator. Dax was positioned in the hallway when the elevator arrived. He had come up, she understood without asking, not because she had requested it, not because he doubted her capacity to complete what she had gone in to complete, but because he was a man who understood placement and had determined that this was the correct place for him to be when she came back through. She looked at him. "Done," she said. He nodded. They rode down together in silence. Outside, the November air was clean and cold, with the specific quality of late autumn mornings that had stopped pretending to be anything warmer. Claire walked through the building's entrance and across the small parking area and reached the sidewalk. 3 car lengths up the street, Garrett Boone was leaning against the side of his truck with his arms folded and his eyes already fixed on the building entrance. He had been in that position since before she came out. He had not moved. He was simply there, present in the exact way she had asked him to be present, a weight in the room even from the 4th floor, even through glass. He did not ask how it had gone. He looked at her face and read the answer the way he had always been able to read it since before she had words for what she was carrying, since the house on Wicker Street, when reading each other's faces had been a skill they had developed in order to survive. "Done," she said. "Done," he said, and something in his shoulders came down by half an inch. She crossed the remaining distance and stopped beside the truck. They stood in the cold together for a moment without words, which was the correct thing. Then he opened the passenger door. Reed Vance left Cedar Falls on a Thursday, 19 days after Monday, 11 days before the 30-day deadline she had specified. She learned this not from him and not from anyone directly connected to him, but from the building manager who mentioned it to the resident below Reed's unit, who mentioned it to someone who attended Claire's Tuesday morning yoga class, who said nothing to Claire directly, but whose expression when she arrived at the studio that morning communicated everything Claire needed to know. The version of events Reed had attempted to establish in the days after Monday did not survive. His email to Wendy Holt had arrived 52 minutes after Dax's call to the parent company's intake director. By the time Wendy Holt had read the email and forwarded it upward with a request for guidance, the intake director had already opened a preliminary inquiry file with Dax's documentation attached. Reed's email was logged and added to that file, where it joined the Sandra Wells case number. In the Franklin County court records, in the screenshot of the Sunday morning text sent to Hazel Ford, who had not been inclined toward the quiet and reasonable conversation Reed had been counting on. The inquiry did not result in criminal charges. Dax had been straightforward about this with Garrett, and Garrett had relayed it to Claire, and Claire had built her plan with clear eyes about what the documentation could and could not support under Ohio statutes as they currently stood. Criminal charges had not been the objective. The objective was the pattern. The objective was that the pattern now lived in a file with Reed Vance's name on it at a level of the organization 2 floors above the one he worked within, and that file would be consulted when his name arose in any subsequent professional context, and his name would arise, and when it did, the consultation would produce a particular result. Reed understood this when HR reached him by phone on a Wednesday. He submitted his resignation the following morning, citing personal reasons precisely as Claire had specified. He was gone from Cedar Falls by Thursday. The version of events he attempted to relay at a bar in a town called Millbrook, 40 minutes east, to a man named Kyle Strand, who had been a mutual acquaintance since the previous spring, collapsed within 10 days. Kyle mentioned the story to someone he was seeing who happened to know Dax's youngest sister, who called her brother, who mentioned it to Claire with an economy of words that told her without elaborating that the necessary people had access to the necessary information. Nobody believed Reed's version, not because anyone had mounted a campaign against it, because Dax had placed the right documentation in the right hands before Reed's version had fully assembled itself, and a story that arrives after the evidence is already in the room has a very difficult time gaining any purchase, regardless of how skillfully it is constructed. That far more than anything Garrett could have accomplished with his hands in a hospital parking lot on a Friday night was the thing that followed Reed Vance out of Cedar Falls. The weeks after Monday had a texture Claire had not anticipated and could not fully characterize. She went back to the studio on a Tuesday 2 weeks following the cast. The 6 o'clock class was waiting when she arrived, 11 people whose names and particular rhythms on the mat she had learned across years of mornings, and when she walked in, they made no occasion of her return. Meredith Holst, who had been attending since the studio opened on Maple Street, looked up from her mat and said, "It is good to have you back." And that was the whole of the acknowledgement, which was exactly right. She taught the class with her left arm in the cast, modifying what the cast required modifying, using words where her body could not demonstrate. She found this unexpectedly clarifying. There was something useful about having to articulate in language the things she normally communicated through movement. She saw Dr. Whitfield on a Thursday. Dr. Whitfield was a woman in her late 50s with an office that carried the smell of cedar and old books and a manner of receiving information that communicated neither surprise nor assessment, only sustained and genuine attention. She had seen Claire through the quiet end of her first marriage, and then Claire had been well and had not returned. She received this return without drama. "Tell me what is different this time," Dr. Whitfield said in their second session. Claire considered the question with the seriousness it warranted. "I handled it," she said, "not without help. I had Garrett and Dax and Hazel, but the decisions were mine. I set what I needed. I chose the timing. I walked in and I walked out, and no one carried me through it." She was quiet for a moment. "That is new. How does that feel?" "Like something that belongs to me. Like something I own in a way I would not own it if someone else had carried it for me." Dr. Whitfield held the answer rather than responding immediately, which was one of the things Claire had always valued about her. "That is an important distinction," she said. Claire thought about the distinction driving back to the studio in the late afternoon. The difference between being carried through a situation and having someone positioned close enough that you know the help is there if you reach for it. The difference between being kept safe and being trusted to keep yourself safe. She thought about her brother making that distinction in a hospital hallway at 11 minutes past 11 on a Friday night, with every instinct he carried pointing him in a different direction. She thought about what it had cost him to hold still. 6 weeks after the cast went on, it came off. The procedure was exactly as unremarkable as medical procedures were designed to be a technician with a small saw that produced more sound than sensation. A release of accumulated pressure she had stopped noticing, until it was absent, and then the strange specific lightness of a limb that had been immobilized and did not quite believe yet that it wasn't. She flexed her fingers one at a time in the fluorescent light of the examination room. The physical therapist, James, practical and encouraging in the way of people who worked at the intersection of injury and recovery, observed and made a note in her file. Range of motion is ahead of where I would expect at 6 weeks, he said. She moved her wrist in a slow, careful arc. There was stiffness in a deep ache that she understood was going to accompany her mornings for some time yet. She made her peace with this standing there in the examination room, which was itself a form of the work. She called Garrett from the parking lot. He picked up on the second ring. Cast off, she said. A pause. 4 seconds. The specific kind she had spent 29 years learning to read. How is it? 3 out of 10. Ahead of schedule. Good. She could hear him somewhere unfamiliar. The acoustic quality of a space she did not recognize. She thought about what Dax had mentioned the previous week, that Garrett had been meeting with someone regularly, a counselor, in an office somewhere separate from the clubhouse, and the ordinary business of running it. That he had established this as a boundary and maintained it without announcing it to anyone, which was its own significant form of change in a man who had spent 4 decades communicating primarily through action. How is that going, she said. He understood what she meant. It is going. That is not an answer. It is the only one available today. She stood in the cold parking lot with her bare left arm exposed to November air. For the first time in 6 weeks, she let the cold land on her skin and stayed with it. You sound like yourself, he said. She considered that. She thought about what herself sounded like and whether the self that had come through the particular fire of the last 6 weeks was the same as the one that had entered it, or something that had been altered by the passage. Not lesser, changed. The way certain materials emerge from heat with properties different from what they carried going in. Harder in some places, more flexible in others, with a different relationship to stress. I am myself, she said. I just needed to hear someone who would know, say it. A pause. 4 seconds. She counted because she had always counted his silences and had learned across 29 years that they carried what he was not yet ready to put into words. Okay, he said. Then quieter. I know. How do you know? Because you sound like you again. She stood in the parking lot with the cold November air on her face and her bare arm and thought about Juniper, about a 3-legged wolf in the tall grass of Wyandotte County who had learned after everything to lift her head when she heard the particular sound that meant something safe was approaching. Not because what had been taken from her had been restored, not because the wound had healed into invisibility, because she had learned over time and with patience to distinguish between the presence of danger and the presence of something that meant her no harm. She had learned to trust the distinction. Claire thought that this was probably true of people too, that you could carry what had been done to you without being required to carry it forward as the permanent condition of every room you entered, that the weight could change its character over time. It could become the thing you had survived rather than the thing that was surviving you. Not gone, not erased, softened at the edges the way certain injuries softened with time and deliberate care without ever disappearing entirely. And she found that she did not want it to disappear completely. Forgetting was not the same thing as healing, and she had no interest in confusing the two. Garrett was still on the line. She could hear the space around him, the particular quality of wherever he was, and she thought about Cedar Ridge and the kitchen table and the folder he had kept for her and returned with 4 words on a Sunday afternoon. She thought about a man who had driven 300 miles in the November cold with no gloves because 4 words landed on his phone and he was already on his bike before the door finished closing behind him. She thought about that same man standing in a hospital hallway choosing to listen instead of move, at the cost of something she understood had not been easy to pay. I want to come up this weekend, she said, if that works. It more than works. She nodded at nothing. The parking lot, the ordinary Monday afternoon of Cedar Falls carrying on around her in the way ordinary days did, indifferent to everything that had shifted inside the people moving through them. I am going to be fine, she said. Not as a thing she was saying so he would stop carrying it, as a fact being stated to the one person who would know the difference between those two versions. I know, he said. She heard something in his voice that had relaxed its guard, the specific warmth that surfaced in him when he stopped monitoring himself for it. You always were, he said. You just needed somebody to come when you called. She thought about that the whole drive back to the studio. She thought about the whistle, 2 notes that a 9-year-old girl had sent out into the dark of a house on Wicker Street, and a 12-year-old boy had always answered. She thought about the way those same two notes had traveled through 20 years and 300 miles of Ohio highway and arrived in a Cedar Falls emergency room intact and functional, carrying the same meaning they had always carried. She thought about what she had done with the time his arrival had created. The plan built sentence by sentence in a plastic chair. The room she had owned, the door she had walked through and closed and not looked back from. Those two things together, that was the whole of it. The person who came when called, and the person who knew what to do with the space that arrival created. Neither one sufficient without the other. Both together something that held. She drove through Cedar Falls in the late afternoon of a Monday that had begun gray and unremarkable, and was concluding the same way, full of people who had no awareness that anything of particular significance had occurred today, and she thought that this was how most important things ended. Not with ceremony, not with a scene that understood its own weight. Just a woman driving through her own town with both hands on the wheel, and the particular knowledge that she had been tested against a measure she had not chosen and had not been found smaller than the moment required. The studio on Maple Street was dark when she drove past. She would open it tomorrow at 6 in the morning, as she opened it every morning, and the floorboards would hold the silence she had built them to hold, and the people who trusted her to help them find their own breath would arrive one by one, and she would do the work she had chosen and constructed and return to. And that would be enough. That would be precisely enough. She pulled into her driveway. She sat for a moment in the car with the engine off and both hands resting open on her knees in the quiet and the cold. With the particular quality of the evening settling around the town, she had decided she was not giving back to anyone. Then she went inside.